The mysteries of time can never truly be understood, but there are some who are bold enough to look into the eyes of Kronos himself, and who dare to undertake dangerous journeys through the ages, though few return with their sanity, and those who do must still face terror at Collinwood. Be careful, my friend, where you tread, for I warn you now, there are spoilers ahead. Welcome to Terror at Collinwood. I am your hostess, Danielle, aka Penny Dreadful, and I am really excited to bring you this episode today. My guest is sensational. But before we get to the discussion, I'd like to remind you that the Rondo Awards are still going on, at least as of this recording, and you can still vote in many wonderful categories here. Please consider writing in Dan Curtis for Monster Kid Hall of Fame. It's a special category in the Rondo Awards. And the previous episode I did, you can hear more about the Monster Kid Hall of Fame. You can write in up to 6 people. Some other suggestions I have for you. Mark Dawidziak, who is in this episode, and I can't believe Mark isn't in the Monster Kid Hall of Fame already. He should be. You'll hear Mark in this episode, you'll hear my intro for him, and you'll hear our discussion. And if you didn't already know Mark Dawidziak, believe me, his contribution to the terror genre, the horror genre, cannot be overstated. I mean, especially when it comes to Kolchak, especially when it comes to the Night Stalker. Mark literally wrote the book on the Night Stalker. Mark Dawidziak, 100% yes, alongside Dan Curtis. And how about Barbara Steele, the legendary horror icon, Barbara Steele, the last of the great horror stars, and of course she has the major Dark Shadows connection for playing Dr. Julia Hoffman in the 1991 revival series, and also for doing that one Big Finish audio with the only one Jonathan Frid did, with Jonathan Frid and John Carlin. Barbara Steele was in that too. But she was in so many classic horror films, Black Sunday, of course, but so many others, The Pit and the Pendulum, and Curse of the Crimson Altar, The Long Hair of Death, and An Angel for Satan, The Horrible Dr. Hitchcock, The Ghost, a lot of these Italian gothic horror films, and then later on she came back and did Piranha. I mean, just look at her IMDb or Wikipedia page and you'll see what I'm talking about. If you're not familiar, if you're listening to this podcast, I assume you must be familiar with Barbara Steele. She's legendary, but Barbara Steele absolutely deserves to be in the Monster Kid Hall of Fame. But Dan Curtis, since he himself was an enthusiast of those types of stories, that just adds another layer to it. I am sad that Dan Curtis isn't in the Monster Kid Hall of Fame, so please vote for him. Also, in addition, Terror at Collinwood is on the ballot as well for Best Podcast. But there are so many great podcasts. I can't even decide who to vote for on this list of podcasts because there are so many good ones. Classic Horrors Club podcast, Monster Kid Radio, Literary License podcast, Bill Watches Movies, the B Movie Cast, the Diecast Movie Podcast. I mean, I could just keep going on and on. There are so many great podcasts. And I also want to mention that there are 2 other Dark Shadows specific nominations in addition to Terror at Collinwood. Under Book of the Year, we have Running Home to Shadows, which was edited by Jim Beard, who was on this podcast, and several of the people in that book have been on this podcast, including the guest in today's episode, Mark Dawidziak, who wrote a piece for it. And also the Collinsport Historical Society was nominated for Best Website. In addition, guests also under Best Website, Raymond Castile's Basement of Horror. Ray was a guest in the 1995 episode. There's Asylum for the Psychotronic under Best Column of 2022, which is written by Ansel Farage, and that's in the We Belong Dead magazine. And then other guests, for example, Rod Labby wrote the House of the Seven Gables article for Scary Monsters number 128. A whole bunch of the horror hosts who were in the horror host episode. Count Gordeval, also under Best Website, but is also listed under Best Horror Host as one of the nominees. But I think most of those hosts that are still active are on there, such as John Dimes, Dr. Sarcophagi. Just off the top of my head, Halloween Jack, the Bone Jangler, Sally the Zombie Cheerleader, Marlena Midnight, Bobby Gamonster, Carlos Borloff, Dr. Gangrene. I mean, it's just basically just go down that list of horror hosts. I don't want to leave anybody out. I know many people on this ballot in many different categories that I've had the pleasure of meeting over the years, many whom I consider friends. So if I leave anybody out, I'm sorry. It certainly is not an intentional omission. There are just so many people, I can't mention everybody or we'll be here all day. So give the Rondo ballot a look. You can check it out at rondoaward.com, and you can email. The way this works is you email your choices into taraco@aol.com, TARACO@aol.com, and you have to put your name on the ballot when you email it, and you have to send it in by Sunday night at midnight, April 23rd, 2023. So there you go. The other thing I wanted to let you know about is Hermes Press, who have been putting out these wonderful books, reprints of the Ross novels, but also the deluxe hardcover editions of the Gold Key comics, the newspaper strips, the digest even. Well, at the end of the recent video that Dan Herman posted, he dropped a little bombshell there at the end. I don't think the word is really gotten out yet, but they're doing a retro 1960s style Dark Shadows coloring book. How cool is that? No images have been released yet, but Dan Herman did announce it in the Hermes Press official YouTube video. You can watch it over on the channel. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. But he did mention there is a retro-style Dark Shadows coloring book coming out. What a cool collectible that will be, because we never had that in the 60s or the 70s. There was never a Dark Shadows coloring book, which is strange to think about. It's like, what? The lunchbox and the coloring book are kind of, I guess, filling in the blanks as far as merchandising. And there were so many Dark Shadows items in the 60s and going into the 70s even. We had a lot of great Dark Shadows collectibles that came out, but we never did get a lunchbox, which we now have, or a coloring book. Brilliant. I love that. I can't wait to see what it looks like. According to Dan, it's going to look like you went in the Wayback Machine, and it's going to look just like it would have if had it come out back then. So I'm really looking forward to that, and I'd love to see more things like that as far as Dark Shadows collectibles. But anyway, I think that's all the news for today. Let's get to the show. Welcome to Terror at Collinwood. 'Tis I, your hostess, Penny Dreadful, taking on the form of Danielle, and I am extremely honored and excited to introduce my guest today. It is Mark Dawidziak. Mark is an author, critic, actor, and Mark Twain scholar. In addition to writing 2 nonfiction books about the Carl Kolchak character, Night Stalking, a 20th century anniversary Kolchak companion, and The Night Stalker Companion, a 30th anniversary tribute, Mark has edited 3 collections of works by Richard Matheson, all published by Gauntlet Press. His work in the horror field includes a 1994 novel, The Kolchak Papers, Grave Secrets, a play, The Telltale Play, short stories, comic book scripts, and the nonfiction book, The Bedside Bathtub and Armchair Companion to Dracula. You may have also seen some interviews with Mark on the MPI Dark Shadows DVD's bonus features. His recent biography of Edgar Allan Poe, entitled A Mystery of Mysteries, The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe, examines the renowned author's life through the prism of his mysterious death and its many possible causes. Welcome to the show, Mark. It's a pleasure having you here.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Mark, I loved your MPI home video interviews. And when I started this podcast a couple of years ago, it's going to almost 2 years ago now, you were right away on my list of people I have to reach out to invite to be a guest on the show, because a lot of what you said in your interview really resonated with me, and I agree with what you said as well. And I often will talk about those topics on this podcast. I'd love to hear, though, how you originally got into Dark Shadows and all things horror, monsters. Were you a monster kid back in the day?
I grew up in New York. In the early 1960s, um, what passed for children's entertainment in New York was really the entertainment of our parents, and in some cases our grandparents. They gave us the Abbott and Costello, the Three Stooges, Laurel and Hardy. That was my earliest influences when I was a kid. They were on all the time on New York television in the early 1960s. And when I was 7 years old in 1963, um, good old WPIX Channel 11 in New York showed a film called Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. And I didn't know what a Frankenstein was. I had no idea. I was there for the Abbott and Costello part of that title. But in that movie, playing Dracula only for the second time on film was Bela Lugosi, and he was wonderful. He in many ways steals the film. It is such a great performance. That performance in that movie turned me into a horror fan at 7 years old. So, this was 1963, and I immediately started scouring the TV listings for anything that looked scary or horrific. We didn't have the term monster kid in the 60s.
Yeah.
That's a more modern iteration or definition for how we kind of refer to kids who grew up with that stuff back then. But if you could see over my shoulder over here, all 13 of my original Aurora monster models are over there.
Yay. Oh,
And the
wonderful.
first one was Dracula. I got,
Mhm.
shortly after I was seeing Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein for the first time. So I was watching the Twilight Zone and the Outer Limits. I was, watching anything that showed up on TV, particularly the old Universal horror movies, but movies from the 50s with, giant monsters sacking major cities. It didn't matter. I was there. So somewhere around 1967, I started to hear that there was a vampire running loose in daytime television and on a soap opera. And I was probably somewhat reluctant to give it a try because a soap opera sounded like the worst possible thing to watch. I couldn't understand why anybody would watch a soap opera. My grandmother watched As the World Turns. She would set up her ironing board in our living room at the same time every afternoon, and she would announce that she was about to watch Her Story, and that's what it was. It was Her Story. I wanted nothing to do. I would watch it and I think, this is the most boring thing I've ever seen on a television set. The most interesting thing about As the World Turns was the Niagara spray starch commercials where the big iron would come down the Niagara Falls. That was the only thing that was even remotely interesting to me. And but I eventually, it was too alluring a thought. Vampire. Well, okay, I got to give this a try. So at this point, Barnabas was already out of the box. Willie had already let him out. So shortly after that, so I was not with Dark Shadows from the beginning by any means. I got into it basically because of the buzz among the horror fans that built. And I quickly got hooked. All of a sudden, I was watching a soap opera. All of a sudden, I had a story, and it was Dark Shadows. And I got the Gold Key comics. I got the Viewmaster reel. I got the Dark Shadows LP with narrations by Jonathan and David. I got the playing cards. I still have the playing cards. I still have most of this stuff, by the way. The Marilyn Ross or Daniel Ross novels. I was getting all of it all through there. So I was hooked. And it was basically because my way in was as a monster kid.
Mhm.
But my older cousins were watching it. My teenage cousins were watching it because it was a phenomenon among teenagers as well. So
Yeah.
they were watching it as sort of a teen phenomenon. I was watching it as a horror show, and that was the great thing about Dark Shadows is it had so many points of entry.
Yeah. Yeah.
You didn't have to be a horror fan to be watching it. You didn't have to be a soap opera fan. You didn't have to be a gothic fan. You could be any one of those things and still watching it.
Yeah.
That's what I've always liked about Dark Shadow fandom. When you go to a convention, when they used to have the festivals and you would go, the fandom was so diverse.
Yes.
It
Yeah.
was wonderful. You'd see couples, you'd see families, you'd see, kids, you'd see people who watched it like me, and they're the first run.
Mhm.
It was really wonderful. I'm sure that people in their minds have a stereotype of what a Dark Shadows film looks like, but there is no stereotype.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just talking about this on the podcast a couple episodes back because when my uncle introduced me to Dark Shadows in the 70s, and then I started watching that started getting tapes from syndication in the early 80s. But I was aware of it from Famous Monsters magazines he'd give me and all of bubble gum cards. And my assumption was always at that time that Dark Shadows was it was horror fans, the classic horror fans that were watching Dark Shadows. But it's interesting looking at the different audiences for Dark Shadows. You have the horror fans, yes, but you also have the soap opera fans, and then you have the teenage fans that were into like the teen magazines, like 16 Magazine and Tiger Beat and stuff, that were getting into it that way. And then you had the college kids that were, hanging out in the dorms and doing, their thing and watching Dark Shadows. So you have all the, like you said, different points of entry for the show. It isn't only horror fans, it's all these other groups of people that are not necessarily also horror fans too.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
It was one of those things which became a part of the fabric of my my childhood. It came along
Mhm.
at a very, very good time. So I started watching when I was starting watching it. I guess I was about 10 years old.
Mhm.
So I was watching it, and then right almost to the end. So, 10, 11,
Okay.
12, right on through.
Mhm.
It's a great age to sort of be hooked on something like that, because
Yeah,
it's a great jump start to the imagination.
absolutely.
It's a wonderful, way in, and you sort of get tied into all of this stuff. And there were things that just stuck with me forever, that I can remember different scenes, different episodes, watching it the first time, and then later on seeing them when the Sci-Fi Channel was double running it in the 90s. Um, my wife is a little younger than I am. My wife is about 5 or 6 years younger than I am, so she did not see Dark Shadows in its first run. She was sort of aware of it. She'd always hear me talking about it.
Sure.
So when the Sci-Fi Channel started, we would watch it. We didn't watch it. We would tape it, and then at night it would be our viewing at night. We would have this ritual where we'd watch an hour of Dark Shadows, 2 episodes a night. And in fact, that was during the period where my wife was pregnant with our daughter Becky. So Becky was introduced to Dark Shadows in utero, 2 episodes a day. And then, I'm not making this up, she actually ended up being born on the 30th anniversary of the premiere of Dark Shadows.
No kidding.
So,
What?
when Becky got to be old enough, you know, say that when she was like 10 years old,
Mhm.
and it was her birthday, and I'd say, today, you know what today is, and she'd say the 40th anniversary of Dark Shadows, right?
I love it. I love it. I love it.
So yeah, I mean, it really did have a big, sort of continuing impact too, as well.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. You mentioned something interesting too, like about being a kid and not wanting to watch a soap opera. And at that time, when I was introduced to Dark Shadows, it was not introduced to me as a soap opera. It was introduced to me as an ongoing spooky show with vampires and drama and thunderstorms. But the gothic characteristics worked well in that structure, because I don't think Dan Curtis initially pitched Dark Shadows as a primetime series, and then they wanted to do it as a daytime series, but that actually worked out really well because you ended up with this serialized Gothic tale, which was a callback to sort of those 19th century serialized Gothic tales.
It was. I mean, you look at the traditions of, because Dark Shadows obviously changes, it
Mhm.
morphs, and it begins more in the tradition of sort of the Bronte sisters.
Yeah.
It sort of begins more with a Wuthering Heights type of feel to it, and as you know, I mean, there wasn't supposed to be anything supernatural about Dark Shadows, and
Mhm.
and there really wasn't until they finally crossed the line and introduced the ghost, uh,
Mhm.
you know, which leads to a phoenix, which leads to a vampire, and we're off to the races at that point. Um, and that was a necessity. I mean, as the the story goes, and Dan loved telling the story, but is that the only thing scary about Dark Shadows after the first few months were the ratings. Is that,
Yeah.
Dan wanted to do a Gothic story, and nobody wanted to watch a Gothic story, and it didn't have anything to do with the quality of the show. It just was not catching on.
Sure.
And the ghost appears, and there's this little blip, and it's like,
Yeah.
and and so it's really the fact that they followed the pattern of necessity, and it turns into a supernatural show.
Sure.
It evolves into a supernatural show, and everything they did was after that was responding to that very first decision of, and they knew they were crossing a line. They knew, when Dan, when the whole discussion of introducing a ghost was like, well, nobody's done this in daytime before. This is crossing a line here.
Yeah.
If we do this, and it's thank goodness they crossed the line.
Absolutely. It was groundbreaking, and then it turned into a phenomenon. I mean, it was just
I hate to say you had to be there, but boy, you did have to be there.
I think to experience
it was a phenomenon. It was it exploded. I mean, and the merchandising, it sets the pattern so much for things that follow, like the Twilight phenomenon of many years later, where you'd go into a Borders or a Barnes and Noble, and there would be, Twilight buttons and posters and things like this. I was like, we've seen this before,
Yeah.
This is the first time this has happened. The pattern was set really in the late 1960s.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that leads me to my first question here. You talk about this in your MPI interviews about how pivotal Dark Shadows was, and that it doesn't get enough credit in several respects. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I talked about two major things in that those interviews. One was that Dark Shadows did not get enough credit as a pivotal show. Is that if you look at and there's two ways to sort of look at it, how it doesn't get enough credit. Let's start with just sort of the vampire story, because Dark Shadows as storytelling, as day in, day out storytelling, and I think the writers would have been the first to admit this, was extraordinarily derivative show. They were borrowing from all of the classics. It's Dan's fave. Dan loved the classics, and Dan loved redoing the classics, and he was at home in that. So they'll redo the Frankenstein story. They'll do the Cask of Amontillado and the Telltale Heart. They'll redo Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or the Picture of Dorian Gray. They're constantly, as Sam Hall once told me, and I'm sure he used this line many times, because I think it was a well-practiced line when he hit me with it. He said, like, if Stephen King was up and running, we'd still be on the air, because we were stealing from everybody. So if you look at Dark Shadows, it's always very, very entertaining, and the characters are always the primary interest, but the plot is always sort of following very derivative things. The interesting thing is always, okay, it's Quentin going through the Picture Dorian Gray phase, or it's Barnabas going through this. The one great innovation that Dark Shadows contributed to all of horror storytelling, but particularly vampire storytelling, was the fact that they set the vampire character free. And what I mean by that is everything in vampire lore, folklore, mythology, and literature through the 1800s leads to the publication of Dracula in 1897. Stoker brings it all together, and Stoker gives us the basically the rule book for vampires. There is no real advance on the vampire character from 1897 to 1967. All during that time, and we see a lot of vampires. We see, Nosferatu and the Graf Orlok character, Lugosi's Dracula, John Carradine's Dracula, Christopher Lee's Dracula. They all are primarily predators. Their goal, their job, is to be a predator. Now, they might have, we sensualize them a little bit as we go. We humanize them. Lugosi's cleaned up. He's looked more like a Valentino type of figure. Lee introduced almost an animalistic sensuality to the character. we certainly did that. But what we did not do is make the last and final jump, and it doesn't happen until Barnabas. Barnabas is the first vampire that gets what a vampire doesn't need. If a vampire is predator, what does he need with a conscience? What in the world would a predator need with not only a conscience, but a desire to change? That had never happened before. I mean, there's a hint of it in Dracula's daughter. If you see that she wants to change, but she reverts to being predator. There's a hint in John Carradine's performance of Dracula, sort of a world weariness and a longing to be rid of the curse. But with Barnabas, there's a full embrace of a conscience. That's revolutionary. That is the moment that the vampire gets completely set free. And every vampire reflects their era. Every single vampire. If you look at, I can do this, with every single vampire who ever say, well, how does Lugosi's Dracula reflect his time? How does Lee's Dracula reflect his time? How does Barnabas reflect it? It's the 1960s. It's this amazing decade where everything's getting turned upside down and inside out. Everybody is questioning their place. And it's a time of liberation movements. It is a time of, gay rights. It is a time of the feminist movement. It is the time of civil rights. It is time, all of these points where people are coming out of the repression of the 50s. And this conform of the 1950s. And in the 1960s, it's like a pressure cooker and it explodes. And if that's going to happen, and a vampire is going to reflect its error, guess what? He is going to question his nature, just like everybody else is. So I'm not saying they did this consciously, by the way, but how beautifully does Barnabas fit the 1960s?
Yeah.
Because Barnabas opens up all possibilities for vampires. He not only says, that he's going to reclaim his soul, he's going to become the hero of the show. He's going to become your central hero. I mean, just think about that for a second. Think about, those 70 years from Dracula to that. How revolutionary is that? And that's why, when I do lectures on vampires and I get to this point in the narrative, I always hold up the cane and say, on the tip of this cane is perched the whole history of the vampire character. And Barnabas Collins, this cane represents nothing less than the Emancipation Proclamation for vampires. After this, vampires can be whatever they want to be, and they can look like whatever they want to be. Who's watching Dark Shadows? Who's going to be influenced by Dark Shadows? Practically everybody, but not the least of which is Anne Rice.
Oh, sure.
Just, a few years later is going to publish a vampire novel in which she's going to take all those questions of Dark Shadows. Can I change? Is it possible to change? Can I reclaim my soul? Who am I? All those questions of Dark Shadows, Anne Rice is going to take, and she's going to run in all sorts of directions with them.
Yeah.
And it's rolling thunder after that. And after that, vampires can look like anything. They get more diverse. They become more interesting. And it's not like we lose the predators. We always have predators.
Yeah.
Always, right. Dan Curtis turns around, and the first thing he does after Dark Shadows is the Night Stalker. And he gives us one of the most predatory vampires of all time. Such an inhuman vampire, he's not even allowed to talk.
Sure.
Not even allowed to speak. So we never lose those vampires. We always get them. We get them in all sorts of movies after that, like John Carpenter's vampires are From Dusk Till Dawn. But we increasingly open the possibilities for vampires, and Dark Shadows did that. And Dark Shadows also kept horror, was one of the key things that kept horror going in the 1960s. We had this horror boom in the 50s, and not only on film, but we had great writers like Robert Bloch and Richard Matheson and Ray Bradbury and Shirley Jackson writing all of this magnificent horror. And you get some in the 60s. You get some of that in the 60s, and you do certainly have like the Roger Corman films and the Hammer films and the Twilight Zone and the Outer Limits. But Dark Shadows is one of those things that keeps horror going and keeps the fandom together and sets it up for the boom in the 70s. Because in the 70s, now you're going to get Stephen King up and running. Now you're going to get John Carpenter on the screen up and running. You're going to get Anne Rice. So Dark Shadows also is that kind of what I like to say is a swinging door.
Mhm.
You know, it's like the old swing doors in every Western in the saloon where you go through the door and the doors would keep swinging back and forth. Dark Shadows is the link to the past, and it's the path to the future.
Yeah.
That's why
Excellent.
it's so important. That's why it's critically important, and it does not get enough credit because it was on daytime.
Yeah.
Is everybody always looks to literature, film, and if they look to television, they look to prime time television. Um, Dark Shadows, it was shot on videotape. It was on daytime. It was a soap opera. For all of those reasons, it was not taken as seriously as it should have been. Even by horror fans, it was not taken as seriously.
Yeah. I mean, people take for granted nowadays things like, Angel or True Blood, for example, Bill Compton and True Blood, and all the Anne Rice vampires having. There's a new series about that. You don't get to them without Barnabas Collins, and Barnabas is an interesting. Yeah, he is.
In many ways splits the bloodline, if you will.
Yeah, he's a
It's like
hybrid almost.
it's a pretty straight line going to Barnabas, and it's almost like if you play pool, if you've ever played pool, and you hit the cue ball and it hits two balls and they both go into two different directions. That's what Dark Shadows did, and
Uh-huh.
it's like I said, you don't lose the predatory. If you like your mean, nasty vampires, like I think it's interesting that about 5 years after Dark Shadows went off the air, there's two books on the bestseller list at the same time.
Mhm.
The first one is Stephen King's Salem's Lot. And Stephen King believed that vampires should be nasty, mean characters with sharp teeth that use them. So he gives us that vampire in Salem's Lot. Same time, just a little while later, here comes Anne Rice with Interview with the Vampire. And she gives us the more sympathetic
Yeah.
vampire, more introspective vampire. And these two things, and they're going to symbolize the two lines that are going to continue to this very day.
And interestingly, both of those authors, Dark Shadows fans, on record as being Dark Shadows fans and having watched the show. And Barnabas is a hybrid. Barnabas could be predatory, especially early on, but even
Oh,
later,
yes.
Barnabas was always there was always an edge to Barnabas. He was always dangerous when he was a vampire. He was the hero of the show, but he was also could be unpredictable. Like, you don't expect Barnabas to strangle Carl Collins in
Well,
1890.
and yeah, he's always dangerous, and that's always what makes him interesting. But
Mhm.
there's Dark Shadows also responding on its feet because
Mhm.
I always I always tell the story, which is that again, Dan was when he decided when the decision was made, not solely by Dan. There were writers and
Sure.
and Leela Sweat, everybody was in on it. Um, but when the decision was made to bring a vampire in, Dan was obviously echoing Dracula. He was going
Sure.
to bring in a vampire who was primarily a threat, and um, as I always say in the lecture, is Jonathan didn't know very much on how to play a vampire. He was an actor. He was,
Yeah.
so he built an interior life, which is what an actor does, especially a trained Shakespearean actor. He did exactly what you would expect somebody to do, but nobody could actually tell him how to play. How do you tell somebody how to play a vampire? How do you tell somebody? And so Jonathan didn't know too much, but the one thing he did know was how long he was going to be on the show because he had a 3-month contract. He also knew how it was going to end. It was supposed to end with a big stick of lumber
Yeah.
coming out of his chest. That was it. He was going to be brought on to be a threat and then eventually destroyed. You know, and out of this comes that wonderful accident, if you will. They recognize it. They recognize that
Yeah.
this guy's way too popular to kill off.
Yeah.
But we have to do something then, and everybody is kind of working together. Part of it's in Jonathan's performance, part
Yeah.
of it's with what the writers are doing. A lot of people get credit for this, but this is the true innovation of Dark Shadows.
Yes.
We
Yeah.
are at it with everything else that you look at. You say, well, that was a replay of that. That was a replay of that.
Mhm.
This isn't. I mean,
Yeah.
I think the two major great innovations of Dark Shadows. The first is Barnabas, because of and then they had to. It wasn't again. It wasn't what they were setting out to do. But
Yeah.
nevertheless, that is the great innovation of Dark Shadows. And I think the second is the Angelique character,
Oh, Angelique,
because I think
absolutely. Yeah.
Angelique's a power figure. She's a, first
Yeah.
off, almost all um, sort of the goth, scary women of horror up to that point were dark haired.
Yeah. Barbara
They almost
Steele.
all had,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
Morticia Adams look,
Sure.
or the Vampira look, if you
Hmm.
will, or whatever. They almost all looked dark with very, and all of a sudden here comes, the dazzling blue eyes and blonde, and she's the power figure in this. She's
Yeah.
in many ways the most powerful figure in the ongoing story in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So I think that was a double too, was the fact that they went so far as to make that powerful a figure a woman in daytime
Yeah.
television.
Well, I asked when I interviewed Lara Parker, I asked her if she was pulling from Medea from Greek tragedy, because that archetype, I think, is what Angelique is. But as you said, it's subverted. She's the blonde hair, blue eyed. She looks like the ingenue, but she has the power of Medea, that vengeful quality of Medea, who is scorned and is going to have her revenge. She said she would love the Greek tragedies, but she wasn't consciously pulling from that. But I don't know if the writers did that intentionally or not, but you also commented, this is I love that you mentioned this too, in terms of reflecting the 60s. Dark Shadows, I think, is the first prominent, other than comedies like The Munsters and The Addams Family, this is the first drama, I think, that presents the supernatural characters as eventually the protagonists of the show. They become the monsters, led by Barnabas there, with the exception of Julia, but she's sort of in that mad scientist-esque category,
Right,
I guess. But
right.
but the other becomes the lead character. They become the lead characters in the show, and the human characters kind of become the victims. They're important too, but the monsters are the ones who are kind of leading the charge there. And I don't think that was ever done before Dark Shadows, at least dramatically speaking, that I'm aware of, in that way, where you're following the story of the vampire and what's going on in his world.
Oh no, and again, that's totally a function of that turnaround for Barnabas.
Mm-hmm.
At that
Yeah.
point, it becomes, and then they do it again with Quentin.
Yes. Yes.
Is that first Quentin is this extremely scary figure who shows up
Yeah.
as a ghost in the West Wing, and he's every time you see him, it's like
Yeah.
and again, look how gradually they humanize him, and then Quentin becomes one of the hero figures
Mm-hmm.
in it. So, oh yeah, you see this, that turnaround, and that's an amazing turnaround. It's easy to almost dismiss it. It's almost easy to go past it
Yeah.
real fast and say, but you gotta, whoa, wait a minute here. Do you understand how revolutionary this is?
And people take it for granted now. All
Yeah,
of these shows, a lot of these, supernatural themed shows now those are the main characters that you follow in the story.
it's a
Are
straight line. And you said it. I mean, it goes like Anne Rice to Buffy and Angel
mhm.
to True Blood and Twilight and the Vampire Diaries. It's a straight continuing line that comes
Mhm.
right out of Dark Shadow. Those are the children of Dark Shadows, right there.
Yeah, yeah.
Those are the descendants of Dark Shadows.
And a lot of those people who created those shows cite Dark Shadows as an influence, like Alan Ball and some of those,
Mm-hmm.
True Blood and Vampire Diaries. What was the other? American Horror Story. American Horror, the creator of that show, also cites Dark Shadows. And it's strange that I was reading online discussion of genre television, and somebody referred to Dark Shadows as the missing link of genre television. I think that's a bit extreme, because I don't think it's a missing link. I think it still has quite a following to it, but I wish that it would be more known. I went to Comic-Con, and it was the 50th anniversary of Batman, Star Trek, and Dark Shadows, and there was Batman stuff and Star Trek stuff everywhere. No Dark Shadows. I think Hermes Press did a panel there with Lara and Catherine, I believe. But I would Will McKinley, who I had on the show, pointed out, well, those other things are owned by big corporations. Dark Shadows is owned by Dan Curtis's daughters, so it doesn't have the kind of the backing. But I wish Dark Shadows had a more of a presence, I think, in pop
There's
culture
that,
today.
and the other thing is that Dark Shadows has not had a truly successful reinvention.
True, yeah.
And that it too is, I mean, you need something to sort of renew the fan base.
Mhm.
And Dark Shadows badly needs a new iteration of some kind
Mhm.
to remind people what it was, what it is. And that's, I mean, if you look at all those big franchises like, the DC heroes, there's this constant reinvention.
Yeah.
That Star Trek, there are constantly new things. Star Wars, all of sort of the big franchises have had huge blockbuster successes. In a way, it's kind of amazing that Dark Shadows is hanging on as long as it is, because there really hasn't been that kind of thing that gives the fandom a jolt
Yeah.
and renews it, and it needs it.
Yeah.
It very, very badly needs it, and it can happen at any time. I
Well,
wouldn't.
Mark B. Perry with his
Right? Yeah.
reincarnation show, the sequel, they haven't done a sequel to Dark Shadows yet in
No.
television. I mean, they've done it's always a remake or a reboot, but they haven't actually attempted to do a sequel. But what I like that idea, just because everything that happened in the original series still happened, but now we're going to find out what's happening now and what happened in the interim between. I think that's an interesting way to approach it, and you can bring in original actors from the original series like Catherine or Lara Parker or David Selby, James Storm, etc., to make appearances or play their characters again, etc. So you can have some fun with that, I think.
The missed opportunity was 91. I mean, there's no question.
Yeah.
Missed opportunity was the NBC primetime revival,
Mhm.
which is, by the way, what got me sort of back into, put me on the map a little bit as far as
Mhm.
Dark Shadows is concerned, because I was a TV critic, full-time TV critic at the time. And that when NBC went ahead and it was the same time that a small publisher in New York approached me about writing History of the Night Stalker.
Mhm.
So this gave me two reasons basically to talk to Dan Curtis and to download Dan Curtis's brain. And that started a very good relationship. I know Dan had a reputation. Dan, Dan had a temper.
Yeah.
The stories are legendary. But Dan and I got along. Dan and I got along very, very well. I remember an interview Roger Davis once gave where he said that something like he was Dan's pet and he was allowed to get away with things. But I think, from the very first conversation, Dan understood that I understood his career,
Yeah.
that I got his career and appreciated what he had done. And I think that sort of clicked right from the start. So if I was in Los Angeles, I would stop by Dan's office or whatever. In fact, the interviews that you had mentioned that are on the MPI release,
Yeah.
guess where those were done?
With Dan's office, or?
In Dan's office. I'm
Oh,
sitting.
wow.
If you could have looked to my immediate left, there was the wolf's head cane that Ben Cross
Oh,
had carried in Dark
wow.
Shadows behind Dan's desk, and facing me was the Zuni doll from one of the models
Oh, cool.
from Trilogy of Terror. So you
Oh,
see me sitting
yeah.
by Dan's desk, but in truth, I'm surrounded by these artifacts of Dan's
Well,
career. So Dan, I always enjoyed talking to Dan. I always enjoyed but that also led to talking to other, and I ended up doing a cover story for Cinefantastique on
oh,
the.
I have that. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So this was, I got to interview the people from the new show and the old show. I interviewed Jonathan. I had already interviewed Jonathan once before.
Yeah.
Um, so I got the chance to go around again with Jonathan and Catherine and Laura, Jerry Lacey, Johnny Carlin. It was David Selby. It was a lot of fun, and that sort of put me back on the map. And then whenever Dan had a new project, he would always willingly jump on the phone with me
Uh-huh.
and talk to me, which he
What was?
wouldn't do because he didn't like, Dan didn't really like journalists very much. He didn't trust them.
Yeah.
But he always seemed to be, if I was in Los Angeles and I'd stop by his office, and the secretary would say, I was coming in,
Yeah.
I put from inside Dan's office, I would hear this bellowing voice go, "Mr. Night Stalker," and then I would sit in front of Dan's desk, and Dan would tell stories. Dan was a great storyteller, both behind the camera and behind a desk. Dan was a
Uh-huh.
great storyteller, and profane as hell. I mean, it was impossible for Dan to put 3 sentences together without maybe 7 profanities. Put in places where you wouldn't put profanity, by the way. Like, well, who puts profanity there? Who says that way? That way? I mean, Dan can talk like a longshoreman,
Yeah.
and after a while, you didn't hear it. After a while, it just sort of phased out. But Dan was. I always felt like I was cheating the world because I was getting like this front row seat, an audience of one getting this front row seat, and I always thought it was a great shame that Dan never went to any of the festivals.
Yeah. Yeah.
I always thought it was just such a crying shame because the fans would have loved him.
Yeah.
And if you just put Dan on the stage, just put a chair on the stage and just let Dan tell his stories, it would have been wonderful.
It seemed like he was intrigued by them, but wouldn't go himself for some reason.
Exactly right. Well, the few times Dan ever got quiet on me was we got to talking about one thing or another, and we broached the festivals. I think I had just been a guest at one of the festivals, and he sort of looked down, and he looked up, and he said, "What are they like?" I said, "Beg your pardon?" He said, "The festivals. What are they like?" And I said, "Dan, go find out for yourself.
Yeah,
go." And he said, "It's not my kind of thing." I said, "Really, really." You have something better to do with your weekend than have thousands of people tell you they love what you did and they love you. And I said, and besides that, if you could do what you do here, just like, what we're doing, they'd love you. They'd eat you up with the proverbial spoon if you did. He never did.
No. I always got the sense, and I'm curious because Dan Curtis always struck me as someone, and I just posted an episode of the podcast where I strung together some interviews with Dan Curtis because I'm trying to get him voted into there's the Rondo Awards. They have the Monster Kid Hall of Fame, and I Forrest J. Ackerman's in there, and Zachary and Basil Gogos, and I'm like, I think Dan Curtis should be in that. And I put together some interviews, and Dan Curtis seemed clearly to be an enthusiast of the subject matter. He talked a lot about, at least when he was a kid, watching all those Universal horror films and being a big fan of Richard Matheson. And his eyes light up when he's talking about the Frankenstein lab equipment that when they did the Frankenstein storyline on Dark Shadows. He seemed to be an enthusiast and was great at telling those stories. And as you point out in your interview on one of the MPI DVDs, that those stories, people kind of look down their nose at horror stories, but they're great story. It's great storytelling that deals with these like archetypal human issues, right, through the lens of the Gothic. But it's become sort of conflated, in the 80s with the slasher thing, and there's a distinction. It's the horror genre, but I think there's a distinction there. And I feel like Dan Curtis, did he start shying away from the horror thing because of that? I got that sense that he was kind of maybe embarrassed by it or something.
I think he burned out. I think one thing is he burned out. Horror is incredibly difficult to do. As you said, if people tend to look down their noses at the two forms that they tend to look down their noses on are humor and horror. And humor and horror, they're twins. They're flip sides of the same coin. They're the metaphoric devices we use to approach difficult subjects we don't like to think about. And they usually approach big subjects like death and pain and family relationships. And it gets right to it. Horror and humor tend to they play it for real. And, and you can't fake them. They're the two things you cannot fake. You can't fake what you scream at with laughter and what you scream at with fright. So, and John D. MacDonald, the mystery writer, when his introduction to Stephen King's first collection of stories, Night Shift, he said something very, very smart. John D. MacDonald was a very smart guy, but he said that these among writers, it is acknowledged that these are the two toughest forms to master. They're the most difficult. They're the ones that get the least respect, and yet they are the toughest to do. There are very few true masters of both. And the reason is that in the wrong hands, the humor becomes horrible and the horror becomes humorous. Oh, that's really good. That's really smart. Now, and Dan understood that. And Dan said, he had done Dark Shadows. He had done Night Stalker and Night Strangle. He'd done Trilogy of Terror and Dead of Night. He had done his Dracula, his Frankenstein. And he said, I couldn't creak another door. It's such a tough thing to do. And I think he also wanted to as he said it to me, the way he said it was that up to the point that he tackled Winds of War and War and Remembrance, he knew that the lead of his line in his obituary in Variety would read, Dan Curtis, who created Dark Shadows, died.
Yeah.
And he never wanted it to be, just that. He didn't want to be just defined by that. He was proud of Dark Shadows, and he was proud of what he had done in the horror field. But I think he wanted to be known. Now, when he got so much acclaim for doing Winds of War and War and Remembrance, and his favorite thing he'd ever done. I mean, Dan would have told you right there, he could have gone on directing that forever because it was his dream assignment, because he was like the general in charge of an army, and he could do whatever he wanted. He could recreate whatever he wanted. So when he did that, and I think it was Warren Littlefield at NBC at that point came to him and said, how about doing a new version of Dark Shadows? Now Dan was willing to listen, because he had changed the lead in his obituary. He knew he knew it would say Dan Curtis, who gave us Dark Shadows, as well as the Winds of War and War and Remembrance. Now he was, secure enough in the fact that his reputation did not just rest on this one thing, that he could go back and try Dark Shadows again. Mm-hmm. And NBC's, was beyond stupid for canceling it after chapter 13. They should have let it go on and see what it might have done. Not only that, NBC was like a sync off that whole in the early 90s. They had another terrific show that only lasted called Erie, Indiana.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah.
It was very good. And then they had another show from Wes Craven called Nightmare Cafe, which was an anthology show.
Yes. Yep.
They could have put those three shows on Friday night and built a perfect lineup. Mm-hmm. But the war, the Gulf War broke right when Dark Shadows premiered. That was, one bugaboo, but the ratings were still not bad, and it ended on just the point where it was like, okay, give them another year. Let's see what they're going to do. Let's see I think if Brandon Tartikoff had still been running NBC, they'd have gotten the other year.
I think so too. Yeah. Because didn't Warren Littlefield regret canceling it later on?
I think he did. I think the number for Dark Shadows and the demographic was very good. And so, but that was an incredibly missed opportunity for Dark Shadows fans.
Yeah.
That would have given a very strong primetime presence and would have renewed the fan base really, really well.
So it seems
that was it.
Yeah, it seems like that all in 2012. I mean, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but that the Burton and Depp film, it would have been. I know they were fans. They talked about being fans growing up, and I wish they hadn't gone in that direction. I know WB also pushed for comedy, and I wish they had really owned the sort of the gothic origins of Dark Shadows and maybe tell a new story or whatever. But
I agree. I mean, I agree completely. Whether you like that movie or not, they took it into the level of farce.
Yeah.
And after promising they weren't, by the way, oh no, we're going to treat this well. And I think that also derailed Dark Shadows too. Mm-hmm. Now, I think it ended up in the hands of the wrong director.
Yeah.
It's not to say that Tim Burton hasn't done wonderful things, and Johnny Depp hasn't done wonderful things. But I think if it had ended up in the hands of, say, Guillermo del Toro.
Yes, I always call him out as the one.
Del Toro. Del Toro loves that era. He knows that stuff backwards and forwards, and he adores that era. And I think he would have done it in a truly serious way.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. I mean, imagine a Del Toro film.
Oh,
yeah. You see, Dan always liked to redo the same thing.
Yeah.
So every Dark Shadows starts on somebody on that damn train heading into Collinsport. That's how it's going to start. There's the train again.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine a film actually starting in Martinique.
Oh, interesting.
In the heat, the sweltering heat of Martinique, and starting in the 1790s with Barnabas being down there and developing the whole Josette Angelique story and telling it from there. And imagine Del Toro doing it.
Oh God. That would have been
imagine
amazing.
what you would have had.
That would have been
Del Toro would have given us a serious vampire movie.
Yeah, I always call him out as the one I wish had directed Dark Shadows, because as you point out, he gets it. I always call him the chosen one, because he grew up just absorbing those tales and just that aesthetic, and just he
Yep.
has an intrinsic knowledge of how to tell those stories in a compelling way and in a meaningful way. And I think it would have been incredible if Guillermo del Toro
I
had
think he would have
taken.
given us something very new, something very stylish, and something very true to the Dark Shadows world. You
Yeah,
know, and that's the magic combination right there. If
yeah,
you can get that, you know.
yeah,
So again, I think that was the missed opportunity. You know,
yeah.
but I will say this about the '91 series is I have a great affection for that, because that was what really, you know, put me into the, you know, I met Jim Pearson doing that, you know, and Jim's remained a very good friend
Hmm.
uh, throughout those years. Um, you know, it gave me an entree to Dan, you know, from there on in. I visited the set. I mean, I went down by the Goldwyn Studios
Uh-huh.
where they had the Collinwood set,
Oh, cool.
you know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then, you know, I always say about the '91 version, the 91 January of '91, NBC had a press party, and they did it at Greystone, which was Collinwood,
Uh-huh.
the mansion in Beverly Hills that is Collinwood. So they rented out the Greystone for the night. They filled it with dry ice and fog. They had, you know,
Oh, I love it.
vampire fangs everywhere. They had Robert Colbert and orchestra playing in the ballroom,
What?
and everybody
Wow.
could was mingling with, you know, the reporters could mingle with the cast, and you know, and the creators, and do their interviews in this setting. And I was like, this is the best party ever. This is the best. This is the best. Yeah, you know, the only thing that rivaled it was when HBO introduced Tales from the Crypt, and they rented out the old Roy Disney mansion in Toluca Lake, and they did somewhat the same thing. And they
Uh-huh.
had, you know,
Oh, yeah,
all
yeah.
these gothic trappings for the yeah.
I love it.
So I love you know, I have very fond memories of the '91 series, you
Yeah.
know, because of that, you know.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, I wish, it's such a shame that I remember the protests even, and even in my city, we had a protest in front of City Hall. I don't know what that would have accomplished in New Bedford, Massachusetts, standing in front of City Hall with signs to protest the cancellation of of the 91, but
Mhm.
it was such a shame. But it's
It was
cool.
Dan had earned the right to for a second season. He had
Yeah.
earned the right to see what would happen in a second. Not to say it would, you know,
Mhm.
necessarily been successful, positively successful, but I think they would have built on it,
Yeah.
and I think they would have, you know, gone on to a decent run if
Yeah.
they had been given a chance.
Agreed. Adrian Paul was going to be Quentin. They were going to bring him back as Quentin, supposedly. I mean, that would have been incredible. To this day, David Selby is still the only actor who has ever played Quentin Collins. So,
Yeah.
and here's a question I have for you. So, if there are a couple questions I want to ask. If there is a new Dark Shadows that happens, what would you say? What would you want to see in a new Dark Shadows, and what would you not want to see in a new Dark Shadows? What would you think would make it work?
Well, the number one thing is that I would hope that they would take it seriously. That
Yeah.
I would hope it would be done with, you know, the spirit of the original.
Mhm.
You know, something I talk about on the MPI home video is that another thing that Dark Shadows gets beaten up about for is all the mistakes that
Yeah.
have come through.
Yeah.
And that's only because it's the only soap opera we still watch.
Yeah.
You know, they were doing 2.5 hours of story a week. You know, they were writing it, casting it, shooting it, you know, and if you were to look at any other soap opera from the time, and when we don't, you see a lot of mistakes. You see a lot of people, you know, bumping into things and knocking things over and calling people by the wrong names. It's not like that was exclusive to Dark Shadows, you know.
Yeah.
And Dark Shadows also was more ambitious than any other soap opera at
Mhm.
the time. They were doing special effects. Yes, the chroma key and things like that look crude today, but they were trying everything. They had fire on the set. Fire was verboten. Dan loved fire on a set. He loved almost every set had fire, you know.
Yeah.
And that was a small little studio where they were shooting in. You know, and for all of that, for all the things that went wrong, Dark Shadows always served up something truly magical in every episode because the actors committed to it. The actors were total. I mean, one of the things that you just have to go back to the appeal of Dark Shadows, the original, and that's why I hope any new iteration gets this. Character, character, character. Yes, the plots were derivative, but what made the plots interesting? The plots would not be nearly as interesting if the characters, like Quentin, like Julia, like Barnabas, like Roger, like Maggie, if those characters did not have our interest, we would not have continued following. So that's part writer, part actor gets the credit for that,
Yeah.
for that wonderful thing. And that's the reason Dark Shadows worked. So if you're going to do a reiteration, the first, and for if I was able to be in the writer's room for 10 seconds, the only thing I would say would be character, character, character. Yeah. You get the characters right, no matter what you're doing, how you're doing this, and you take those characters seriously and don't play them as a joke. You got a chance. You got a shot at making this happen, making this work. Whether if you're going to do a new generation, if you're going to, however you're going to do this, you've got a really good shot at making this work. But it's got to be in the character. Mm-hmm. If it's not there, it ain't going to work.
What about Barnabas? Do you recast or not?
That's a really good question. That is I'm not a purist when it comes to this. I mean, I get this argument a lot on the Columbo front, because most Columbo fans would basically say nobody can wear the raincoat but Peter Falk. Peter Falk is the one and only. That argument was made about Sherlock Holmes generation after generation. The first stage actor was William Gillette, who played Sherlock Holmes, and he's the only one who could play it, and then Basil Rathbone made it his, and no, he's the only one. We've been through this, and how many great Sherlock Holmes interpretations have we seen? Mm-hmm. My argument would be this: if Barnabas is a great character, and I believe he is, if Barnabas is one of the great horror characters of all time, then he is open to reinterpretation. Then he is Hamlet. Mm-hmm. Then he is any great role. And he is open to reinterpretation. Mm-hmm. He is open to a new actor coming along and making it his own, as long as he stays true to, who Barnabas is, just as any actor has to stay true to what Hamlet is. But mm-hmm. it doesn't mean we can't have a whole lot of different Hamlets or a whole lot of different Sherlock Holmes. Right. So redo Barnabas. In principle, I'm not opposed to that. Okay. Redo Barnabas the way Tim Burton did it? No. But I like Ben Cross's Barnabas. Yeah. Let's start right there with Ben Cross and say, mm-hmm. Ben Cross came up with an interpretation which was true to the Barnabas Collins character, but didn't remind you of Jonathan.
Yeah, he did his own thing, but it was still in line with Barnabas. It's still recognizably is Barnabas Collins. Is there anything you really don't want to see in a new show?
I wouldn't put that kind of juncture on something, because anything can work. Anything can be made to work if it's done right. Okay. It's not the idea; it's the execution of the idea. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And plenty of bad ideas, plenty of ideas that sounded totally ludicrous. Mm-hmm. If you just said it. Yeah. If you just said, well, we're going to do this movie about this guy who was able to clone dinosaurs on an island.
Yeah, right.
That sounds stupid.
Right,
that's oh, no, it's Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
So it's the execution that's the most important thing. So, it's not the idea so much as I want to know who it is. It's like I said, if the Dark Shadows film was being done, and I had heard that Guillermo del Toro was doing it.
Sure.
I would be much more enthused about it. So it's the people who are involved and their intentions that are much more important to me, than what the basic idea is. Because most basic horror ideas and fantasy ideas, if you just explain it, sound stupid. It's hard to make a fantasy idea sound, and that's the problem with horror is horror makes special demands on the suspension of disbelief. Mm-hmm. And it basically makes you buy into the impossible or the improbable. And so if it's done right, if it's done correctly, any idea can work. Right. No matter how dumb it sounds. And like I said, there are plenty of ideas which sound dumb, which turn into blockbusters.
Sure. Mm-hmm. I think as long as they get the tone right and capture that. It's interesting when you watch Dark Shadows, it almost exists in its own, it's I mean, it's a town in Maine, but it's very isolated, and they don't reference like, um, Pringles potato chips or whatever. They don't. It's just kind of in its own fantasy, or Jonathan Frid used to call it the Dark Brigadoon. That kind of
Yeah,
world, and
that's what it is. And that's the one thing about Dark Shadows. Because Dan goes from Dark Shadows to Night Stalker, and then the Night Stalker movies lead to the Night Stalker series, which Dan was not involved in.
mm-hmm.
It only lasts a season.
Yeah.
The one thing those two things had, those as influential as both of those are, and both of those are incredibly influential on the generation of people going to do horror who follow. It's almost everybody is influenced by one or both of those.
Yeah.
But the one thing those two things have in common is they never figured out a mythology.
Mm-hmm.
This is dark with what is it about Collins' part? What is, why is it doing this? Now, if you were doing Dark Shadows today, if it was just brand new, the first thing you probably would figure out is, is this thing built over a hellmouth? What
Yeah.
what is
why does it attract all this supernatural?
And the same thing with the Carl Kolchak characters. After a while, you say, what is it about this guy that he keeps attracting all this stuff? That every week he's running into a zombie, a vampire, Jack the Ripper, whatever. You have today you'd explain it, and the generation that was influenced by this stuff that come along in particularly the 90s, when you get the X-Files and Buffy, and the first thing they did was to create a mythology. It was to create, that's what they do now, and comic books have had a lot to do with that.
Sure.
Comic books have almost had more influence on that than anything else. But that's one thing about this, is that it would be a question. I'm not saying I would be for it or against it, but I would be saying, you're going to come up with a mythology, aren't you?
Yeah.
You're not going to do this and just say it's Collins' sport. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing Dan Curtis would always say in the interviews, and the writers, they ran out of ideas. We did, Turn of the Screw. We did Frankenstein, blah, blah, blah. We ran out of ideas. And I always feel that was kind of a cop-out answer. I think it's more that they were all just burned out, as just tired by the end of the run of Dark Shadows, because there are so many tales that they could have still incorporated into the tapestry of Dark Shadows. And I recently wrote an article for Stuart Manning's The Daytime Gothic magazine that he's putting out about, and it was 10 Gothic tales that could have been incorporated into Dark Shadows had it kept going. Are there any sort of, archetypes, like monster or terror archetypes or stories that you think would have worked with Dark Shadows? Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's not so much that. But this is something which I've always made. Dark Shadows was almost by design going to burn out.
Yeah.
Eventually.
Yeah.
It is sort of a meteor.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not uncommon to a lot of sort of those pop culture phenomenons that happened in the 60s, where like Batman was this phenomenon, and it only lasts 3 seasons. It's over. Before it almost begins. You see this in the 60s, where eventually something's it gets that hot, it's going to cool off.
Yeah.
But another problem with Dark Shadows was, and this is where they kind of, I think, sowed the seeds of their own destruction, although this will probably be a matter of debate among Dark Shadows fans, and that is, Dark Shadows actually moved pretty fast for a soap opera.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure today you look at Dark Shadows and go, is it ever going to go on? Is it going to move the story on? But the truth is that Dark Shadows actually did, by soap opera standards, go very fast. The whole idea of a soap opera was that if you missed a week, you could come in the next week and pick it up, and not really, I went on vacation for a week or 2 weeks and I missed 2 weeks. Well, it's all right. You can pick it back up. We're still here. You missed 2 weeks of Dark Shadows. You might be, you'd have to call somebody and say, what the hell happened with Aristide? I just wasn't, I was on vacation. And, so that was one thing. They moved faster than most soap operas did. They had that conceit where they would build through the week to the big dun 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 dun, ending on Friday, come back Monday. But they became increasingly more complex. They now are introducing parallel time from different times, and they became very, very complex, and it became harder. Now you're missing a week, and now you're coming back and going, are we in 70s parallel time here. What are we?
Yeah.
It became harder to keep up with it a little, because they were becoming more complex. I think that more than anything was the what sort of led to the tail off in the ratings
Mhm.
was, it was cooling off anyway. The meteor was going to burn out anyway, and on top of that, you had this increasingly complex storyline that you were being asked to follow. Um, I don't know that it would have continued under regardless. I think we all like to think Dark Shadows could have run for 15 years and
Right.
gone through all these iterations. I think Dark Shadows did what it was supposed to do.
Right.
I
Right.
think it did what it was supposed to do, and then and it ended. Yeah, I would have liked to have seen closure.
Mhm.
I wish they could have wrapped it up,
Yeah.
considerably better
Agreed.
than they did, and I certainly would have liked them for them to have wrapped it up. That moment before they do the Bromwell character when you know Professor Stokes and Julia and Barnabas come back,
Yeah.
and there's this moment. It almost feels like that's the ending to me.
Yes. Yeah.
It's almost like this moment of this is where it should end. This is where it should be. And but yeah, I sure in this day and age, you would probably have gotten more of a wrap up, more of an ending, and more of an explanation. But
Mhm.
they were always moving so fast, and there
Yeah.
was always continuity, and there was always the what happened to Chris Jennings, what happened to Adam, what
Right.
all of these kind of questions which were left hanging because they were doing a soap opera and trying to do 2.5 hours. And I explained this to my students when I taught the vampire and film and television class at Kent State, and I would show them excerpts from Dark Shadows, would show them some black and white, and then I show them some the color ones. And they were, first off, they were kind of mesmerized that something like this was happening every day
Yeah.
in television. But they would snicker at the mistakes too,
Yeah.
a little bit. And I'd say, guys, how long is Avatar? And it's a couple hours. Yeah, it's a couple hours. How long did James Cameron work on Avatar? How much money did he have? How many people worked on Avatar? Look at the
Yeah.
credits for Avatar. There are
Yeah.
hundreds of, there's about 1,000 people listed in this.
Yeah.
These guys were doing 2.5 hours a week.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have to understand, this is like a cross between theater and television,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, and then these was like a repertory company is what you had here of
Right.
actors. And, under those circumstances, they're doing really good work
I
here.
think sometimes people, modern audiences or younger people, maybe have a difficult time looking at things through that lens. Like they can't keep it in its proper context. And I never, I get, it bums me out when I see people like laughing at error mistakes and things like that. I mean, yeah, okay, there's a blooper, a fly landed on somebody. Okay, that's funny, but that's not the show. That's People need to look past that, I think, and look at the acting and the writing and the drama and the storytelling, the sets, the music. I mean, it's just the fact
You'd
that
sure be missing an awful lot if that's what you focused on.
yeah, I
You know,
think so
if
too.
I think you sure, but I do know. I mean, look, I had students who couldn't look at black and white,
Yeah,
you know,
I know people who like that too.
and
They don't
what are
watch
you going
black
to
and white
do?
movies. Yeah.
What are you going to say? If you're not going to give it a chance, think
Mhm.
of the riches you're denying yourself.
Absolutely. Like you
Because
mentioned,
of
all of
that.
those great, they used to show those here too. I used to watch those with my uncle, the great comedians, the Marx Brothers and W.C. Fields and Laurel and Hardy and all of these great, I mean, that's all in black and white. All of these,
My students didn't know who W.C. Fields was.
no kidding.
Even iconically, they didn't know who the Marx Brothers were. Not even Groucho.
Oh,
They did not know. You might
no.
as well have been talking about leaders of the communist revolution. They had no
Wow.
idea who you're talking about.
Wow, my students had no idea who Bela Lugosi was. I had a Lugosi a necklace with Lugosi on it, and somebody said, "Oh, professor, who's that on your necklace?" I said, "Oh, it's Bela Lugosi." Silence. I said, Dracula?" And then, "You guys know Dracula, right?" "Yeah, it's the actor who played Dracula in the classic film." "Oh, but there's no."
They didn't know Karloff. They didn't know,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
and I would show a film with Karloff
Wow.
excerpts with in one of my, and I would say to them, you know Karloff, but you just don't know Karloff.
Right. Oh, that's a great way to put it. Yeah.
And they look at me, and I'd say, all right, think of the Monster Mash. They all knew the Monster Mash from Halloween. And I said, no, think
Sure.
of the voice. I was working in the lab late
Yeah.
at night. I said, that's Karloff. That's a
Yep.
Karloff impression. I said, and now think of the how the Grinch Stole Christmas, the what you grew up with, and the narrator. That's Karloff, the
Yeah.
voice.
Yeah.
So you, even though you don't know that you know Karloff, you do.
Yeah.
And we did the same thing with Darren McGavin when we got to the Night Stalker, and I would say, I'm going to tell it to you now. He's the old man in Christmas Story.
Christmas Story.
Rather than have you going, where do I know this guy from? This is a younger version of something. I'd go before the penny drops. I'm going to tell you this is that guy.
Yeah.
Oh no, you're absolutely right. They don't. Now the great thing is though, the wonderful thing is because I would show Lugosi's Dracula in my vampires. They loved it.
Oh,
And they
awesome.
love Lugosi's performance because of his total commitment to the role. It was one of their favorite things they watched.
Yeah.
All through. So the magic of Lugosi's performance still works on them. If they give him a chance, you got to get him to give it a chance.
That's the thing. Yeah. Yeah. And
they had to watch it in class. And then when they did, they were glad they did.
Yeah. One thing that really warmed my heart, I guess, when I went to Seaview Terrace, Collinwood, Bob Bissell has these get-togethers there, and I met a group of young Dark Shadows fans in their 20s, and they were just as enthusiastic about it as all the other fans. And I had them on the podcast recently because they have their own little online community, a Discord community, and they were great. And I said that gives me hope that people will continue to find, young people will continue to find Dark Shadows fun.
Well, it's like I said, it is a very enriching thing for me, to say, I always feel like I'm sort of giving back because, I've spent most of my journalistic career, 43 years in working in newspapers. Most of them was spent as a TV critic, and other TV critics did not get Dark Shadows.
Oh.
They did not understand. They tended to dismiss it like everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Not everybody. There were a few TV critics who did grow up with Dark Shadows, just loved it. And I remember there was a Dark Shadows festival at the Hollywood Renaissance Hotel on Hollywood Boulevard, right next to the Grauman's Chinese Theater.
Mm-hmm.
And Jim Pearson had asked me to show the pilot to the attempt to do the WB.
Oh yeah, the 2004 pilot.
Yep. With Alec Newman. Mm-hmm. And he said, would you show the pilot and set it up and talk? And I said, yeah, sure, that'd be fun. So, I took the stage and I was going to show the pilot, and there were 3 TV critics in the back, and they happened to be the 3 other TV critics who just loved Dark Shadows. And I said to them, I know you think of me as your TV critic because, I'm, sort of the go-to TV critic when it comes to Dark Shadows things. I said, but in the back of the room, there are 3 people. And everybody turned around and looked at them and gave them a standing ovation.
Oh, that's great.
And they told me later on it was one of the greatest moments of their lives.
Oh, that's so
they've had this sort of reckoning from the Dark Shadows fans coming back to them.
I love that.
That's really wonderful. So it's things like that Dark Shadows given. They getting to write the short story for the Kolchak anthology that crossed Kolchak and Barnabas.
Yes, yeah.
And being able to come up with that idea and take it to Dan. Say to Dan, I got an idea.
What did Dan think when you first presented him?
He loved it. Oh, you just bring together his 2 iconic horror guys. And I said, I wouldn't do this just to do this, but I think I've got a nexus. I think I've got a real cross here. And then I went to Jeff Rice, who created Kolchak, and told him the idea. Well, they both loved it. And so they both gave me permission to do the story. Dan let me use Willie and Barnabas as characters in the story. And Jeff let me use Kolchak. So
that's so cool.
It was so I mean, those are the kind of rewards that you get, like, years later, you go, the university is going to give you this.
Yeah,
that's do this.
Wow, that's incredible. Mark, can you tell us a little bit, just before we close things up here, can you tell us a little bit about one of the authors that was used prominently in Dark Shadows and some of the storylines was Edgar Allan Poe?
He was
pointed out, Cask of Amontillado. And can you talk a little bit about your new Edgar Allan Poe biography, which looks very, very fascinating? I was reading a little bit about it, and I said, oh, this sounds really cool.
Yeah, this is another gift that the universe has given me, because I've carried Poe throughout my life. I've always been and I've basically built up a reputation of scholarship for Mark Twain. 5 of my books are Twain centric. And it was actually an editor at St. Martin's who suggested that I write about Edgar Allan Poe. And I would have never had the ego, I guess, to have said, I should be the person to write about Poe. But this editor said, oh, well, I how could you not? You check a lot of the boxes. I didn't see it. Sometimes it takes somebody else to point out, the obvious. And in this case, he said, you've written about horror subjects like, Dracula and the Night Stalker. You've written about mystery subjects like Columbo. You've written about great American writers like Mark Twain. You've written literary biography. You were a critic most of your life. He was a critic most of his life. How does this not check all your boxes? And I thought, that kind of makes sense. But, then I was sort of, what kind of book do you want? And it became clear pretty fast he wanted a book that claimed that it could solve the mystery of Poe's death. And I said to him at the time, if that's the book you're thinking about, I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's responsible to claim you can definitively prove how Poe died. It's a cold case. There was no autopsy. He died in 1849, and even if there had been an autopsy, it would have been worthless, because the art of the autopsy really comes into the modern age during the Civil War. That's when we got very, very good at cutting up and dissecting bodies. So even if Poe had an autopsy, they wouldn't have known how to do it. They would have been doing it with the equivalent of butcher's knives. There was no death certificate. There's no surviving soft tissue that can be subject to modern forensics. The witnesses that do exist around his death are unreliable at best, contradictory, sometimes contradicting themselves in different. So I said, this is as cold a case as you can possibly have. But what I will do is I will write an examination of his life through the prism of the mystery of his death, because that's why the subtitle is reversed. The subtitle is The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe. And the reason it's reversed is because most biographies start where life begins, with when somebody is born. In Poe's case, it always seems to start with his death. We always seem to start the conversation with the mystery of how he died. And Poe dies in 1849. He's buried the next day in a small Presbyterian cemetery in Baltimore. Miserable affair, attended by almost no one. And the next day he's buried again because somebody he thought was a friend publishes an obituary which sets out to make Poe a scoundrel, a drunk, an immoral person. And this person was actually nursing grudges against Poe all these years, and Poe didn't know it. So Poe is buried yet again under this mountain of misconception and lies. And then they dug him up in 1875 because they wanted to put a big monument there at that point. And the part of the cemetery where he was buried, there wasn't room for the monument. So they dug him up and they buried him again. This guy keeps getting buried.
Yeah.
Now, if any Dark Shadows fan or Edgar Allan Poe fan know, there's one rule that applies to both. Nothing stays buried.
Yeah.
And Poe emerges from the grave to be not only our most iconic writer of Gothic and horror fiction, he also emerges to be probably the best read American writer, not only in the United States, but around the world, because everybody gets Poe.
Yeah.
Everybody. You got him. I got him. Every 7th grade, you used to get The Telltale Heart and The Raven, and then you get him right through high school. If you take college literature courses, you're probably going to get Poe again. Everybody gets Edgar Allan Poe. And everybody has an idea of what Poe looked like. Mm-hmm. I say Poe, you got an image in your mind.
I think Poe and Twain are probably the two most
They're the only
recognizable.
ones.
Yeah,
they are.
recognizable.
Can you pick Herman Melville out of a police lineup? You know what? And not only that, we market them. There's merchandise forever. Poe even more than Twain. You can go into a BAM or a Barnes and Noble and see shelves of merchandise devoted to Edgar Allan Poe. Where are the shelves to Melville? Where are
Yeah.
the shelves to Emerson?
Hawthorne.
Yes. So Poe, he gets the last laugh in all of
Yeah.
this because he emerges from the grave and he's triumphant.
Hmm.
So that's why Death and Life of
Yeah.
Edgar Allan Poe. And then on
Yeah.
the way,
That's
I
great.
said, if I come up with what I think is a convincing, plausible theory as to how he died, I will present it. I do.
That's great.
I think I've got the answer, but I would not insist on it because it's not provable.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if somebody else says, no, 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 I think he died of this. Okay, fine. I've got no dog in the fight.
And it's on Amazon, right? It's available
Mhm.
on
Oh yes,
Amazon and bookstores,
bookstores near you.
bookstore, Barnes and Noble, etc. Yeah. Have you seen the Poe statue in Boston where he was born? Yeah.
I make that part of my. There are three statues to Poe. One in Richmond,
Yeah.
which was the city of his heart. The one in Richmond is a very staid statue of him sitting, and
Yeah.
it's just got no. Then there's the one in Baltimore, the city where he died, and it's a little bit better. He's sitting, but he's sort of getting up, and it's almost like telling a story. It's got a little more action. It's better. Boston's got the best statue
Oh,
because
it's great.
Boston's in full stride, and it's he's got the
It's
valise,
coming
the
back to
razor,
Boston.
yes, the city of his birth.
Yeah.
He had a problematic relationship with Boston.
Yes, yep. I tell my students that too, because most of them are not. I do a class on Poe and Lovecraft,
Mhm.
and I start out by telling them that they were both born in New England, and people who know Lovecraft, not a lot of people, more people now that seem to know who he is, but when I first started teaching it, a lot of people didn't. But they seem to know, okay, Lovecraft is Providence. When I say Edgar Allan Poe was born in Boston, they don't like really they didn't know, and because he's so associated with Baltimore or with Virginia. Like he was born in Boston, and I explained how he had a problematic relationship with Boston, the literary Longfellow, and Poe
Yeah.
is yeah.
The Frog Pondians, as he called.
Yes, yep, exactly, yeah. And Boston
Well,
had an issue with Poe. They didn't embrace him until recently when they put that statue up because they didn't. I think Boston held the grudge for a while there too.
Poe's life is defined by five Eastern cities. He's born in Boston. He finds a family in Baltimore, and then he's going to end up dying there. He grows up in Richmond, and he starts his career as a magazine editor in Richmond.
Yeah.
And he ends up in New York in a cottage in Fordham near in the Bronx, what is now the Bronx. But those four cities, all have a claim on Poe. But so does a fifth, and it's the one that really people don't think of it, and that's Philadelphia.
Oh
He
yeah.
spent 6 years of his adult life in Philadelphia, and
Yeah.
those were the years when he produced most of his greatest stories.
Mm-hmm.
Almost all of his hits are done in Philadelphia. When he lives
Yeah.
in 5 different residences in Philadelphia, only one of them still standing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when the Telltale Heart and the Fall of the House of Usher and all of his greatest stories are done during this golden period that he's in Philadelphia, and nobody associates Philadelphia with him.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, you're right.
But those
Yeah.
5 cities are pretty much define Poe.
Yeah, yeah. I think they could have done it would have been interesting as a final storyline on Dark Shadows to do the fall of the House of Usher or some aspect, maybe merge it
The
with the
collapse
haunting
of
of Hill
Collinwood
House.
is
Yeah. With the merging
they
of Hill
certainly
House.
echoed
Yeah.
a lot of. At one point, I did a sort of a cross to figure out just how many stories they did, and I forget how many. But I mean, certainly the Cask of Amontillado, certainly
Yeah.
the Telltale Heart,
Pit and the Pendulum.
Pit and the Pendulum, Ligeia
Yeah.
is in there. There's at least 5 or 6 stories.
Oh, the premature burial.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, obviously.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I'm sure that there are probably more in the mix too. Well, Mark, thank you for taking the time today to sit down with me and chat about Dark Shadows and Dan Curtis and all of your wonderful experiences as a fan and also as a professional who worked on Dark Shadows. And it's been a pleasure talking with you. So thank you.
Like I say, you've got me on a favorite topic here, and and I'll always, like I said, as a TV critic, I was a champion of Dark Shadows, and I remain one. As a horror fan, as a as an author, whatever standing I have left as a TV critic, I still will be a champion of Dark Shadows, because I think, like I said, it's crucially important, and does not get the recognition it deserves. And I'll always be there, raising that flag, saying, you if you don't appreciate Dark Shadows, you don't get it.
Yeah.
You don't get the whole arc of vampire storytelling, horror storytelling, and in some ways television history. It's crucially important to all three.
Absolutely. And I try to explain that to some of my friends who are into, pop culture stuff, and they're into vampires and all this. I'm like, you got it. Dark Shadows is key. You got to watch it. And they started watching it. Like, oh, it's kind of slow. And I was like, as you pointed out, it isn't really. Well, I think they started with some of the early episodes. I might have to tell them, try again with 1897 or see how that goes.
Yeah, if you start, with some of the early episodes, it can. When's it going? When does this start? When does it get going?
Yeah.
And I like the early episodes. I mean,
I do too. I love them.
I've got nothing against the early episodes, and there's some wonderful actors in there. Mitch Ryan.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Who also got his, David Selby and Mitch Ryan both got their start at the Barter Theater. Huh. And I interviewed them both. That's my first book, was a history of the Barter Theater in Virginia, which was this wonderful theater, which is also the most haunted theater in America, by the way.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, there's a whole chapter in that book about the ghosts, but amazing number of actors got their start at the Barter. Gregory Peck, Ernest Borgnine, Ned Beatty, Patricia Neal, wow. Hugh Cronin. They all got their start at the Barter. And Mitch Ryan and David Selby both got their start at the Barter. Huh. So I interviewed them for that book. Yeah. Like 1980.
Oh,
so
yeah. Wow.
So the Dark Shadows connections are always there. They're always there.
Thank you again, Mark. I appreciate you taking the time. Folks, if you enjoy the podcast, please do subscribe to the podcast, whether you listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcast. Terror at Collinwood has invaded all podcast apps. Also on YouTube, there is a special video version of this episode, so you can head on over to YouTube and subscribe there. Please do like the video, watch the video, whatever they do. Ring the bell. I don't know. I guess that notifies you if you get new videos. So that's great. And I want to thank my guest again for joining me. And I will see you next time at Terror at Collinwood. And for as long as they lived, the Dark Shadows never truly vanished, for there will always be Terror at Collinwood. Terror at Collinwood is a Penny Dreadful production.